Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. On May 4th, 1980, Yugoslavia fell silent. Radios across the Federation carried the same announcement. Josip Broz Tito, the man who had held the country together for nearly 4 decades, was dead. In Belgrade, workers stopped in the streets. In Sarajevo, people wept openly. In Zagreb and Ljubljana, the reaction was quieter, more restrained, but no less uncertain. For all his iron rule, Tito had been the referee who kept the Balkans from tearing itself apart. Without him, no one knew what would come next. The funeral was immense. Leaders from both East and West arrived. Brezhnev from Moscow, Thatcher from London, Carter's envoy from Washington. It was one of the largest gatherings of Cold War statesmen, a sign of how Tito had walked a line between the superpowers. As his coffin lay draped in the red flag of Yugoslavia, a simple truth loomed. The man was gone, and with him, the authority that had forced Croats, Serbs, Bosniaks, Slovenes, Macedonians, and Montenegrins to march in uneasy lockstep. For many Yugoslavs, the loss was personal. In his later years, Tito had become more symbol than man. His portraits hung in classrooms, his speeches played before football matches. But he was also the face of stability. One Sarajevo shopkeeper recalled in her diary, "When Tito lived, we argued, but we never feared. The day he died, I knew fear was coming." And fear spread quickly. The federal system Tito left behind was fragile by design. A rotating presidency meant to balance power among the republics. But instead of harmony, it created paralysis. Serbs, the largest group, resented being just one vote among many. Croats and Slovenes saw the presidency as another excuse for Belgrade's dominance. Albanians in Kosovo felt ignored altogether. The economy faltered almost immediately. Inflation climbed, jobs disappeared, and foreign debt mounted. Yugoslavia, once hailed as a socialist success that allowed its citizens to travel freely across East and West, began to feel the chill of stagnation. And in that chill, old songs and old grudges stirred again. For years, Tito had silenced nationalism, sometimes by censorship, sometimes by prison walls. Now, with his grip gone, those voices returned. Croats whispered about independence in kitchens. Serb intellectuals held meetings where they spoke of victimhood and betrayal. Slovenian workers questioned why their wealth was sent south to support poorer republics. Kosovo Albanians demanded autonomy. In the villages, neighbors still shared bread, but the way they looked at each other was changing. A Serb farmer might remember the stories his grandfather told of Ustaše massacres during World War II. A Croat family might recall decades of being sidelined in a state dominated from Belgrade. A Bosniak shopkeeper might quietly wonder if there was any place for Muslims in a Europe that seemed to forget them. At first, this was only tension, words, speeches, arguments in parliament. But history in the Balkans has sharp teeth. Tito had not solved the region's divisions. He had only frozen them. And now, with the ice cracking, everyone could hear the river rushing below. One Western diplomat later wrote, "It was as though Yugoslavia was a house with too many rooms. Tito had locked the doors between them. When he died, the doors swung open, and every room was armed." For now, in 1980, the guns were still silent. But the silence was heavy, and across Yugoslavia, people waited for the first sound of shattering glass. To understand why Tito's absence was so dangerous, one has to understand what Yugoslavia actually was. It was not a nation in the traditional sense, but a patchwork sewn together after the First World War. In 1918, the kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes was proclaimed. Serbia, victorious in war, absorbed territories that had belonged to the collapsing Austro-Hungarian Empire. Later renamed Yugoslavia, it was home to Orthodox Serbs, Catholic Croats and Slovenes, Muslim Bosniaks, Albanians, Macedonians, Montenegrins, Roma, and Jews. A crossroads of empires had become a single state. At its heart was Belgrade, capital of Serbia, and seat of federal power. Even under Tito, a Croat with Slovene roots, the city symbolized Serbian influence. This imbalance was never forgotten. For Croats, it felt like an old story repeated, their destinies managed from another capital. For Slovenes, wealthy and industrious, Belgrade represented a drain on their resources. For Kosovo Albanians, it was a reminder that their identity remained invisible in a state that spoke Serbian at its core. Yet Yugoslavia was not simply a cage. Under Tito, it offered freedoms rare in the Cold War world. Unlike other socialist states, Yugoslavs could travel. Tourists from Germany and Italy filled Dubrovnik's beaches. Yugoslav guest workers found jobs in Switzerland, sending remittances back home. Sarajevo hosted the Winter Olympics in 1984, a spectacle meant to show that this multi-ethnic state could be modern and confident. Daily life reflected that mix. In Sarajevo's Bashar Shia district, the call to prayer from mosques mingled with church bells and cafe chatter. A Bosniak tailor might work next door to a Croat baker who lived upstairs from a Serb musician. These interwoven lives made the idea of Yugoslavia more than just a political project. It was visible on every street. And yet, even then, shadows lingered. Old wounds from World War II had not healed. In Croatia, the memory of the Ustaše regime, a fascist puppet state that murdered Serbs, Jews, and Roma, was still raw. In Serbia, families passed down stories of massacres, of neighbors turned executioners. In Bosnia, the Holocaust had left deep scars, with whole communities erased. Tito's government censored nationalist songs and punished open hatred, but history lived quietly in family stories, whispered around dinner tables. One survivor from Vukovar later remembered his grandfather telling him, "We live together, but we do not forget. The stones remember more than people do." For audiences outside Europe, it can be hard to see why this mattered so much. But in Yugoslavia, history wasn't just the past. It was ammunition waiting to be used. Where Americans might view the Civil War as distant memory, in the Balkans, events from half a century ago felt like yesterday, and centuries-old battles were recalled as though they had been fought last week. Tito understood this. His regime functioned as a lid on boiling water, pressing down every attempt to stir old grievances. With him gone, the lid rattled. By the late 1980s, inflation and unemployment gave nationalism fertile ground. Politicians discovered that invoking identity won applause faster than promising reforms. And slowly, room by room, the federation began to pull apart. For now, the house still stood, but its foundations, ethnic trust, economic stability, faith in Belgrade, were cracking. The story of Yugoslavia was not yet tragedy, but the outlines of one were already visible. The 1980s were supposed to be a decade of cautious stability for Yugoslavia. Instead, they became a slow unraveling. The economy was the first warning sign. Factories shut down, inflation soared, and breadlines lengthened. By the middle of the decade, debt had spiraled out of control. For ordinary families, this was not just numbers on a chart, it was lived reality. A Croat mother from Osijek later remembered in an interview, "I would stand for hours just to buy oil and flour. Every day felt like less of a life, more of a waiting." As frustration spread, nationalist leaders seized the moment. In Serbia, the rising figure was Slobodan Milošević, a man who discovered, almost by accident, the power of playing to identity. In 1987, he visited Kosovo, where Albanians and Serbs clashed bitterly over autonomy. Speaking to a crowd of angry Serbs, he declared, "No one should dare to beat you." It was a short phrase, but it lit a fire. Overnight, Milošević was no longer a dull bureaucrat. He was a hero to Serbs who felt besieged in their own land. Elsewhere, similar voices emerged. In Croatia, intellectuals revived talk of national revival, invoking the Croatian Spring that Tito had crushed in the 1970s. In Slovenia, leaders spoke bluntly about autonomy and control of their own wealth. Even in Macedonia, whispers of independence began to spread. Nationalism was becoming the currency of politics, and it spent easily. For those outside the Balkans, the question was often asked, why didn't the West intervene early? The answer lay partly in timing. The Cold War was ending. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. For Washington and Western Europe, the focus was on German reunification, NATO's future, and a new world order. The Balkans seemed peripheral, a regional problem. And in the US, scars from Somalia, where American troops were killed in Mogadishu in 1993, would later make leaders hesitant to send soldiers into messy conflicts abroad. Inside Yugoslavia, meanwhile, the tension was tangible. Parliament sessions became shouting matches. Newspapers turned into partisan weapons filled with accusations of betrayal. At football matches, nationalist chants drowned out the referee's whistle. One Serb fan recalled, "We sang louder about our nation than about the game. We knew the stadium was no longer just a stadium, it was a battlefield of words." Yet it would be wrong to think the entire decade was only fire and fury. There were still attempts at cooperation, still everyday life. Weddings were celebrated, students studied abroad, families picnicked on the Adriatic coast. But beneath the laughter, the ground was shifting. Neighbors who had shared wine for years began to ask questions silently. Would they stand with us or against us when the time came? By the close of the 1980s, Yugoslavia was no longer a state bound by brotherhood, but by suspicion. And suspicion, once awakened, rarely goes back to sleep. The cracks were widening, and soon they would split the federation apart. By the dawn of the 1990s, two republics had grown restless, Slovenia and Croatia. Both were wealthier, both looked westward, and both believed they carried more than their share of Yugoslavia's burdens. For them, Belgrade was not a center of unity, but a drain. In Slovenia, the move was pragmatic. Leaders in Ljubljana argued that their economy, closer to Austria's in style and culture, was being forced to subsidize poorer southern republics. Slovenian newspapers began publishing editorials openly questioning the logic of staying in Yugoslavia at all. To many Slovenes, independence wasn't an act of defiance. It was common sense. Croatia's path was different, more emotional, and more dangerous. Here, Franjo Tuđman emerged as the face of nationalism. A historian and former partisan, Tuđman promised to restore Croatian pride after decades of perceived Serbian dominance. His speeches stirred crowds with talk of sovereignty, Europe, and the right of nations to self-determination. But his rise terrified the Serb minority inside Croatia. Memories of World War II lingered when the fascist Ustaše regime had carried out massacres of Serbs under the Nazi-backed independent state of Croatia. For Serbs in Krajina and Slavonia, Tuđman's independence sounded like the first step toward their destruction. The Yugoslav People's Army, the JNA, was supposed to remain neutral, the protector of all Yugoslav peoples. But by 1990, it was shifting. More and more officers were Serbs. Its loyalty tilted toward Belgrade. As Slovenia and Croatia prepared their own local defense units, the JNA moved quickly to disarm them. Trucks of rifles and ammunition were seized, leaving the two republics vulnerable. What was framed as federal order felt, in practice, like a declaration of war. Tensions reached the streets. In Knin, Serb villagers erected barricades declaring their refusal to accept Zagreb's authority. In Zagreb, Croats marched with red and white flags, demanding independence. Each rally was mirrored by a counter-rally. Each slogan was met with another. One young Croat student later remembered, "In 1988, I had Serbian friends. By 1990, we didn't talk. We didn't even make eye contact on the tram." Internationally, the winds were shifting too. Germany, newly reunified, quietly signaled sympathy for Slovenian and Croatian independence. But other European powers hesitated. Britain and France feared that breaking Yugoslavia apart would unleash chaos, and they were right. The United States, distracted by the Gulf War in 1991, preferred to watch from a distance. To outsiders, Yugoslavia was still a far-off conflict in a place many could barely find on the map. Inside Yugoslavia, though, the map was all that mattered. Every line on it was being contested. Every roadblock, every banner, every speech another cut into the fabric of the Federation. By 1990, Slovenia and Croatia had made their choice. They would not remain in Tito's House of Nations. But if leaving seemed easy in theory, in practice it meant confronting not only Belgrade but the Serb minorities within their own borders. Minorities now armed, emboldened, and ready to resist. The moment was approaching when words would fail and only bullets would speak. The spark came in the spring of 1991 in a small village on the Danube, Borovo Selo. On May 2nd, Croatian police attempted to remove Serb roadblocks erected in defiance of Zagreb's government. They were met by armed Serb paramilitaries, some reportedly supported by volunteers from across the border. The clash turned violent almost instantly. Gunfire cracked through the quiet fields. By the end of the day, 12 Croatian policemen lay dead, their bodies mutilated. The images shocked Croatia, coffins draped in flags, mothers screaming at funerals. In Belgrade, the narrative was different. Serbian media broadcast pictures of Serb villagers, claiming they had been defending themselves against Croat aggression. Each side told a story that confirmed its worst fears. For Croats, Borovo Selo was proof that Serb minorities were rebelling under Belgrade's direction. For Serbs, it was proof that Croats intended to suppress and even destroy them. A Croat survivor of the ambush later recalled, "We were boys with pistols against men with machine guns. That day, I knew the war had begun." Weeks later, the tension became irreversible. On June 25, 1991, both Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. Flags were raised in Ljubljana and Zagreb. Crowds filled city squares in jubilation, waving banners, singing national anthems. For them, it was the fulfillment of decades of longing. But in Belgrade, independence was seen not as liberation, but rebellion. The Yugoslav People's Army, under orders from the federal presidency, moved to suppress the breakaway. Tanks rumbled toward border posts. Fighter jets roared above Slovenian skies. The first open battles of the Yugoslav wars had begun. The focus fell on Slovenia. A tiny republic, wealthy and homogeneous, it seemed the easiest to subdue. Yet its people resisted fiercely. The 10-day war that followed was brief, but it proved something dangerous. Belgrade could no longer impose its will by force without bloodshed. For Croatia, the lesson was harsher. Unlike Slovenia, it had a large Serb minority, well-armed and backed by Belgrade. Its independence would not be won in 10 days. It would be fought village by village, city by city, for years. Borovo Selo was remembered as the first blood, a village whose name marked the end of Yugoslavia's uneasy peace and the beginning of a decade of war. 2 days after declaring independence, Slovenia faced the might of the Yugoslav People's Army. On June 27, 1991, armored columns rolled into the green valleys of the Republic. Their mission? Secure border crossings, airports, and communications, and reassert federal control. On paper, it seemed a simple task. Slovenia was small, only 2 million people, with no heavy weapons of its own. But Belgrade underestimated the determination of a republic that had planned carefully. Slovenian leaders had secretly armed their territorial defense forces and positioned police to block key routes. Villagers stacked logs across roads. Firefighters parked trucks in narrow passes to trap convoys. Farmers used tractors to hem in tanks. The result was a series of tense standoffs and sudden clashes. In the border town of Gornja Radgona, Slovene forces ambushed armored vehicles, destroying several. At Brnik Airport near Ljubljana, police exchanged fire with federal troops. Helicopters, thought untouchable, were shot down by shoulder-fired missiles, a humiliation for an army that had once prided itself as Tito's modern force. For Slovenians, it was a war for dignity as much as for freedom. One young defender later recalled, "We fought with whatever we had. Some of us carried hunting rifles. But when we saw their tanks halted on our roads, we believed we could win." Casualties were limited compared to what would follow. About 70 dead, including soldiers and civilians. But the symbolism was enormous. The Yugoslav army had not crushed Slovenia in hours. Instead, it found itself bogged down, demoralized, and facing international scrutiny. Pressure came quickly from abroad. The European community, alarmed by the speed of escalation, intervened. On July 7th, the Dayton Agreement was signed. Slovenia and Croatia agreed to a 3-month moratorium on their independence, and the federal army began withdrawing. By October, Belgrade gave up entirely. Slovenia was free. For Slovenia, it was a victory. Independence achieved with relatively little bloodshed, but it also sent a dangerous message. The JNA had failed, and others now knew it could be resisted. And while Slovenia celebrated, Croatia braced itself. Unlike Slovenia, Croatia's population included nearly 500,000 Serbs, many living in areas Belgrade was eager to protect. The short war in Slovenia would be remembered as a prelude, a rehearsal for something far bloodier. Slovenia had broken free in 10 days. Croatia would not be so fortunate. By mid-1991, the republic stood on the brink of collapse. Its declaration of independence had been met not with swift recognition, but with rebellion from within. Nearly 500,000 Serbs lived inside Croatia, concentrated in Krajina, Slavonia, and parts of Dalmatia. Fearing Zagreb's new nationalist government, they declared their own Republic of Serbian Krajina, raised roadblocks, and armed themselves. With Belgrade's backing and the Yugoslav People's Army shifting openly to their side, Croatia faced not only external pressure, but internal fracture. For Zagreb, the situation was desperate. The UN arms embargo, meant to contain violence, had crippled Croatia instead. Its territorial defense units had been disarmed months earlier. Soldiers trained with hunting rifles and smuggled pistols while their enemies rolled out tanks, artillery, and aircraft. A Croat volunteer later recalled, "We had 2 rifles for 10 men. We passed them around, pretending we were an army. The imbalance was stark. Villages across Slavonia became battlefields. Croat homes were torched, Serb houses shelled in return. Refugees, many on foot, others pushing carts with what little they owned, flooded into cities like Zagreb, Split, and Rijeka. Slobodan Milosevic, now the undisputed voice of Serbian nationalism, pushed harder. His rhetoric grew sharper, invoking the dream of a greater Serbia stretching from the Danube to the Adriatic. On Serbian television, nightly broadcasts warned of Croat fascism, while in Croatia media depicted Serbs as aggressors and occupiers. Fear was amplified on both sides, each convinced survival meant victory at all costs. Internationally, the reaction was cautious. Germany began to signal support for Croatian independence, but Britain and France worried about inflaming the war. The United States, preoccupied with the Gulf War, treated Yugoslavia as a European problem. Diplomats urged dialogue while shells already fell on Croatian towns. For Croats, international hesitation felt like betrayal. By late summer, skirmishes turned into sieges. Towns like Osijek and Karlovac came under relentless bombardment. Croatian soldiers dug trenches with bare hands, bracing against artillery barrages that never seemed to end. In some villages, neighbors who had lived side by side for generations now fought each other across barricades. And in eastern Slavonia, on the banks of the Danube, one city was about to endure the full fury of the war. Its name would soon be known across the world, Vukovar. On the banks of the Danube sat the modest city of Vukovar. Before 1991, it was known for its factories, its river port, and its mix of Croats, Serbs, and Hungarians who lived side by side. By autumn of that year, it became a synonym for destruction. The siege began in August. Yugoslav army tanks encircled the city, joined by Serb paramilitaries. For 3 months, they unleashed a storm of artillery and rockets, pounding Vukovar day and night. Apartment blocks collapsed into dust. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded. Electricity failed, food dwindled, and water had to be collected from shattered pipes under sniper fire. The defenders were hopelessly outnumbered. A few thousand Croat soldiers and volunteers, armed mostly with rifles and Molotov cocktails, held off an army that dwarfed them in size and equipment. They dug tunnels through basements, moving unseen between ruined houses. A survivor later said, "We fought room to room. Every wall became a front line." Civilians endured the siege with a mixture of courage and despair. Families huddled in basements, children covering their ears as shells thundered overhead. One nurse at Vukovar's hospital recalled performing surgeries without anesthesia, lit by candles, as shells rattled the windows. International journalists smuggled out footage of the devastation, burned streets, wounded children, mass graves, and the world watched in horror. Yet the response abroad was limited to condemnation. For Western capitals, the Balkans were a maze of ancient grievances, and no one wanted another entanglement so soon after the Cold War. Ethnic conflict became the easy explanation, even as entire cities were wiped out. By November, after 87 days, Vukovar finally fell. The defenders, starved and broken, surrendered. But surrender brought no mercy. At Ovčara Farm, more than 200 captured soldiers and civilians were executed, their bodies dumped into pits. The massacre would become one of the darkest symbols of the Croatian War. Vukovar lay in ruins, its streets rubble, its people scattered, its memory scarred. Yet for Croatia, the city became a rallying cry. "Remember Vukovar" was painted on walls, whispered in refugee camps, shouted at rallies. It was both tragedy and defiance, proof that Croatia could resist, even if it bled. But while Vukovar was being reduced to ashes in the east, another jewel of Croatia was about to be attacked. Not an industrial town this time, but a medieval treasure whose destruction would shock the world, Dubrovnik. While Vukovar smoldered in the east, in the south, the war struck at one of Europe's most beautiful cities, Dubrovnik, the pearl of the Adriatic. Perched on Croatia's coastline, its medieval walls and terracotta rooftops had drawn tourists from around the world. To many foreigners, Dubrovnik was not just a city, it was a dream. But in October 1991, dream became nightmare. Yugoslav and Montenegrin forces advanced, surrounding the city from land and sea. Artillery batteries opened fire from the hills above, and for the first time in centuries, cannon shells rained down on Dubrovnik's ancient walls. For Croats, it was a wound to their national soul. For the world, it was a cultural crime. Television footage showed smoke rising above the UNESCO-listed Old Town, its streets littered with rubble and broken glass. Centuries-old monasteries and palaces bore the scars of modern war. International newspapers ran headlines not just about military losses, but about Europe's heritage under siege. Inside the city, life was a blend of fear and resilience. Civilians lined up for water at public fountains, darting through streets when shelling paused. A Croatian defender later recalled, "We had a handful of rifles against their tanks. Sometimes all we could do was fire a shot so they knew we were still here." In basements, families huddled together, trying to reassure children with stories of better days. The siege of Dubrovnik galvanized international opinion in a way Vukovar had not. Vukovar was tragic, but unknown to many abroad. Dubrovnik, with its postcard beauty, was instantly recognizable. The attack made headlines from Paris to Washington. UNESCO condemned the shelling, and European diplomats decried what they called the destruction of civilization's memory. And yet, outrage did not bring salvation. For months, the city endured bombardment while foreign powers debated. Britain and France feared deeper involvement. The United States, focused on the Gulf War and later Somalia, kept its distance. The European community dispatched envoys, but their words could not stop shells. Beyond Dubrovnik, the wider Croatian front was bleeding. In towns like Karlovac and Osijek, artillery pounded neighborhoods into dust. In Dalmatian villages, Serb militias and federal troops forced families from their homes. By the winter of 1991, nearly one-third of Croatia was under enemy control, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. But Dubrovnik's suffering carried symbolic weight. If Vukovar became Croatia's internal rallying cry, Dubrovnik became its international one. The war was no longer invisible. It was burning across the television screens of the world. And yet, even as attention grew, the war dragged into stalemate. By early 1992, peacekeepers arrived, ceasefires were signed, and lines were frozen. But the violence was far from over. For while Croatia bled, another republic was preparing to make its own bid for independence: Bosnia and Herzegovina. By the winter of 1991-92, the war in Croatia had settled into a grim stalemate. The great offensives were over, front lines hardened into trenches, checkpoints, and barricades. Villages lay abandoned, fields mined, highways cut by burned-out vehicles. For Croats, this was a war of survival. With little heavy weaponry, they clung to whatever ground they still controlled. Soldiers rotated between muddy trenches and ruined towns, sharing meager rations of bread and beans. One Croat fighter later wrote in his diary, "We had one blanket for 3 men. We passed it from shift to shift like a trophy of warmth." For Serb forces, bolstered by the Yugoslav army, the goal was consolidation. They entrenched themselves in Krajina and eastern Slavonia, fortified positions, and pressed for international recognition of their self-declared republics. Belgrade's hand was clear, though often denied. Weapons, officers, and propaganda flowed steadily across the border. Civilians bore the worst of it. In both Croat and Serb villages, families fled in columns, pushing carts, driving tractors, carrying children wrapped in blankets. Entire neighborhoods were emptied overnight, their houses marked with crude graffiti to show who had lived there. One grandmother from Pakrac recalled, "We left with a bag of bread and photographs. Everything else was lost to the smoke." The humanitarian cost mounted. By early 1992, hundreds of thousands were displaced. Schools functioned in basements, markets were makeshift stalls of smuggled goods, and hospitals ran on dwindling supplies. International aid agencies began to arrive, bringing convoys of flour, medicine, and blankets. But they could not bring peace. The United Nations stepped in, dispatching peacekeepers to enforce ceasefires. On paper, their blue helmets were to stand between warring sides. In practice, they could do little but monitor lines and report violations. Restricted by mandates and politics, they were powerless to stop ethnic cleansing or protect civilians. To many locals, the UN came to symbolize passivity, present but unable to act. Why did the world hesitate? Partly, it was timing. The Cold War had just ended, and Western powers were unsure how to act in the new order. Germany, haunted by its history, pushed for recognition of Croatia and Slovenia. Britain and France feared that hasty recognition would inflame the war. In Washington, policymakers remembered the humiliation of Mogadishu in 1993, when U.S. soldiers were killed in Somalia, and recoiled at the idea of messy intervention in the Balkans. To many in the West, Yugoslavia was dismissed as a quagmire of ancient hatreds, not worth spilling foreign blood to resolve. And so the war froze into attrition. Croatia remained divided, its territories partly occupied, its people scattered. The guns still roared, but the map barely changed. For Croatia, it was not peace, but a painful pause. Yet even as Croatia struggled, events in another republic would soon erupt into violence. Bosnia and Herzegovina, with its fragile ethnic balance, was preparing for its own leap toward independence. And in Bosnia, the war would be bloodier still. In early 1992, all eyes turned to Bosnia and Herzegovina, a landlocked republic at the very heart of Yugoslavia. Unlike Slovenia or Croatia, Bosnia was no simple equation. It was a mosaic, roughly 44% Bosniaks, Muslims, 31% Serbs, and 17% Croats, scattered across towns and valleys where neighbors prayed in different churches and mosques, but shared markets, schools, and streets. That same diversity made Bosnia beautiful and dangerously fragile. The question of independence came to a head in March 1992 when a referendum was held. Bosniaks and Croats voted overwhelmingly for secession from Yugoslavia. The Serbs, guided by their leaders in Pale and backed by Belgrade, boycotted the vote entirely. The result was clear. Bosnia would declare independence. The reaction was immediate. Barricades, gunfire, and the first blood in Sarajevo. For ordinary people, the shift was disorienting. A Bosnian teacher later remembered, "On Friday, my Serb colleague and I drank coffee together. On Monday, she no longer spoke to me. By Wednesday, her husband was in uniform, guarding a checkpoint at the end of our street." The Yugoslav People's Army, now openly dominated by Serbs, moved to support the Serb minority in Bosnia. Paramilitaries organized under Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic declared the creation of their own Republika Srpska. They did not plan to remain in Yugoslavia so much as to carve out a new Serb state across swaths of Bosnia. At the same time, Croat leaders in Herzegovina formed their own quasi-state, Herceg Bosna, aligning themselves with Zagreb. Bosnia, unlike Croatia, faced not one opponent but two. Sarajevo, the capital, became the first major target. In April 1992, snipers appeared on the hills surrounding the city. The siege had begun, though few imagined it would last almost 4 years. The international community, once again, hesitated. The European community recognized Bosnia's independence, but did little to defend it. The United Nations imposed an arms embargo meant to calm tensions. But like before, it crippled the weaker side, the Bosniak-led government, while Serbs retained access to the weapons of the Yugoslav army. Diplomats urged negotiation, but on the ground, artillery already thundered. For the people of Bosnia, independence was not a moment of liberation, but the opening of a nightmare. Refugee columns formed almost overnight. Villages were emptied, men separated from women, civilians detained in camps. The phrase ethnic cleansing entered the world's vocabulary, a chilling euphemism for forced expulsion, mass killing, and terror. Bosnia's war had begun, and unlike Slovenia or Croatia, there would be no quick victories, no neat borders. It would be a conflict where alliances shifted, where every side fought every other, and where civilians suffered more than soldiers. And at its center, Sarajevo would become both a symbol of resistance and a scar on the conscience of the world. In April 1992, Sarajevo, once celebrated for hosting the Winter Olympics only 8 years earlier, was surrounded. Serb forces occupied the hills above the city, their artillery pointing down like knives. Snipers positioned themselves along the ridges, watching the streets below. Thus began what would become the longest siege in modern European history. Nearly 400,000 people were trapped inside. Roads were blocked, airports cut off, water and electricity severed. Daily survival became a test of will. Families cooked over makeshift stoves, burning furniture for heat. People queued for hours to fill bottles at a public tap, darting for cover whenever sniper fire cracked. A Bosnian teenager later recalled, "Crossing the street felt like running across a stage, knowing someone was waiting in the dark with a gun. Life persisted despite the horror. Teachers held lessons in basements, chalking words on damp walls while shells shook the ground above. Musicians staged concerts in bombed-out halls, defiantly playing Mozart as artillery echoed through the valley. Journalists smuggled out footage of weddings celebrated in cellars, proof that even in a city under siege, people clung to fragments of normal life. But the suffering was relentless. Mortars landed on markets, trams, and bread lines. On February 5, 1994, shells tore through the Markal marketplace, killing 68 civilians in an instant. The images: bodies among overturned baskets of fruit, cobblestones slick with blood, shocked the world. And yet, Sarajevo endured such scenes not once, but countless times. International reaction was slow and halting. The United Nations declared Sarajevo a safe area, but its peacekeepers were lightly armed and forbidden to intervene. Aid convoys trickled in, but were often looted or delayed. The West, haunted by the Somalia syndrome after its disastrous mission in Mogadishu in 1993, was reluctant to risk soldiers' lives in Bosnia. For Sarajevans, blue helmets and food trucks offered little comfort when shells continued to fall. By the time the siege ended, nearly 14,000 people had been killed, including over 5,000 civilians. Sarajevo was scarred beyond recognition. Ottoman mosques pocked with bullet holes, Austro-Hungarian facades gutted by fire, whole neighborhoods reduced to rubble. Yet the city never surrendered. Its survival became its greatest act of resistance. For the world, Sarajevo became a symbol, not just of suffering, but of endurance. A reminder that even in the darkest days, people will cling to life, to laughter, to hope. But as Sarajevo bled, the war in Bosnia widened. The fragile alliance between Bosniaks and Croats was crumbling, and soon Bosnia would face not a two-sided war but a conflict with three fronts. By 1993, Bosnia's war had become more than a clash between Bosniaks and Serbs. The fragile alliance between Bosniaks and Croats collapsed, shattering Bosnia into a brutal three-way conflict. At first, Bosniaks and Croats had fought side by side. Both faced Serb artillery, both endured sieges, both saw their villages emptied. But ambition, mistrust, and outside influence drove them apart. In Herzegovina, Croat leaders declared their own mini-state, Herceg-Bosna, aligned with Zagreb. Soon, Croat militias turned their guns not only on Serb forces, but on their former Bosniak allies. The result was chaos. Towns changed hands multiple times in a month. A Bosniak family might flee Serb shelling, only to be expelled days later by Croat soldiers. Refugee camps filled with people who had been displaced twice, even 3 times. One Bosnian woman later remembered bitterly, "We no longer asked, who is enemy, who is friend? We only asked, who will let us stay the night?" Ethnic cleansing spread on all sides. Croats expelled Muslims from villages in central Bosnia. Bosniak militias retaliated in Croat-held areas. Serb forces continued their campaign across the Drina Valley, leaving behind burned houses and mass graves. Civilians, not soldiers, carried the heaviest weight, driven from their homes, forced into camps, or killed because of a name, a faith, a surname. The Bosniak-led government attempted to break the stalemate. In September 1993, they launched Operation Neretva 93, a massive offensive along a 200-kilometer front. It was meant to reclaim territory, restore morale, and prove that Bosnia's state still existed beyond Sarajevo's ruined streets. But the operation collapsed into stalemate. Exhaustion, poor equipment, and the sheer impossibility of fighting 2 enemies at once drained the effort. International diplomacy struggled to keep up. Negotiators in Geneva sketched maps dividing Bosnia into cantons and zones, hoping to freeze the war with pen strokes. But every proposed border meant cutting through a village, separating families, legitimizing ethnic cleansing. Each peace plan was announced with ceremony, and each crumbled in days. For outside observers, Bosnia seemed a puzzle of ancient hatreds. But for those inside, it was a tragedy of collapsing trust. Bosniaks, Croats, and Serbs had lived side by side for generations. Now, alliances shifted overnight. One day's neighbor was tomorrow's jailer. The war was no longer about independence or unity. It had become a struggle for survival, waged across three fronts, with civilians trapped in the middle. And in this chaos, atrocities mounted, massacres, camps, and horrors that would force the world to finally look harder at Bosnia's agony. By 1994, Bosnia was no longer a war fought in shadows. It was broadcast daily into living rooms across the world, and what the world saw was horror. The most shocking came on February 5, 1994, when mortar shells struck Sarajevo's Markale marketplace. Shoppers had been buying bread and fruit when the explosions tore through the crowd. 68 civilians were killed, more than 100 wounded. The cobblestones were stained red, baskets of apples and oranges scattered among the bodies. Foreign journalists captured the aftermath, images too raw to ignore. For the first time, global audiences could no longer dismiss Bosnia as a distant quarrel. It was a massacre in the heart of Europe, half a century after the Holocaust. But Markale was only one tragedy among many. Across eastern Bosnia, villages were cleansed. Men were separated from women, marched away to fields, and shot. Women and girls were subjected to systematic rape in camps. Violence used not only to brutalize, but to terrorize entire communities into fleeing. The phrase ethnic cleansing became common in news reports, a sterile term for what survivors described as terror beyond words. In theory, the United Nations had declared safe zones in Bosnia, places where civilians could find protection under peacekeepers. In practice, these zones became fragile enclaves, often little more than traps. Blue helmets lacked both the weapons and the mandate to intervene. A Dutch peacekeeper later admitted, "We had rifles, they had tanks, we could only watch." Why was the international response so halting? Part of the answer was political paralysis. The US, haunted by its 1993 disaster in Somalia, feared another quagmire. Britain and France had troops on the ground as peacekeepers and worried that stronger action would endanger them. NATO was divided, unsure whether it should act outside its traditional Cold War role. And so, while diplomats debated in Geneva and New York, Bosnia bled. Still, the massacres built pressure. The Banja Luka incident in 1994, when NATO jets shot down 4 Serb fighters violating a no-fly zone, marked NATO's first combat action in history. Airstrikes followed, hitting artillery positions around Sarajevo. It was a signal, small but important. The West was finally moving from words to weapons. But the worst was yet to come. In July 1995, the town of Srebrenica, one of the UN's safe areas, fell to Bosnian Serb forces. Over 8,000 Bosniak men and boys were executed in a matter of days, their bodies dumped in mass graves. It was the largest massacre in Europe since World War II. Srebrenica shattered illusions. The world could no longer pretend this was just another Balkan feud. It was genocide. And it forced NATO, at last, to prepare for decisive intervention. After Srebrenica, the world could no longer look away. The killings had exposed the hollowness of promises, the weakness of peacekeepers, and the limits of patience. For the first time, NATO prepared to act with full force. In the summer of 1995, waves of NATO aircraft struck Bosnian Serb positions. French Mirages, American F-16s, and British Tornadoes thundered over the Balkans, bombing ammunition depots, artillery sites, and communication hubs. In Sarajevo, citizens listened to the rumble of bombs with a strange mix of fear and relief. One resident wrote in her diary, "For the first time in years, the sound from the hills was not only shells falling on us, but bombs falling on them." On the ground, momentum shifted further with Croatia's bold offensives. In May, Operation Flash recaptured western Slovenia in just 2 days. Then in August came Operation Storm, a massive strike across the Krajina region. In 4 days, Croatian forces broke through entrenched Serb defenses, advancing with speed that stunned observers. Towns once occupied for years fell overnight. For Croats, it was liberation. For Serbs in Krajina, it was catastrophe. Nearly 200,000 Serbs fled, their tractors and carts forming endless convoys down dusty roads. Homes were abandoned, villages emptied in days. Many would never return. Operation Storm reshaped Croatia's war, ending the rebel enclaves, but at the price of a new refugee crisis. Bosniaks and Croats once bitter enemies, now coordinated offensives. With NATO air power above and joint forces advancing below, Bosnian Serb lines buckled. Cities under siege for years were liberated. Even hardened commanders began to see that the war could not be sustained. Internationally, the shift was clear. NATO had crossed the threshold from peacekeeping to war fighting. Diplomats sensed an opportunity. With Serb forces reeling and their territorial gains shrinking, negotiations might finally succeed. And so the warring leaders, Bosnia's Alija Izetbegović, Croatia's Franjo Tuđman, and Serbia's Slobodan Milošević, were summoned to an American airbase in Ohio. The place was called Dayton. What they signed there would bring the bloodshed to an end, but not without compromise. In November 1995, 3 delegations flew to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, Ohio. Bosnia's Alija Izetbegović, Croatia's Franjo Tuđman, and Serbia's Slobodan Milošević arrived under heavy pressure. From Washington, from NATO's bombs, from exhaustion after nearly 4 years of war. For weeks, they walked the corridors of the base, trading maps, drawing borders, arguing over towns and rivers. The talks were tense, sometimes breaking down, but the message from the Americans was clear: this war must end. The deal that emerged was not elegant, but it was workable. Bosnia and Herzegovina would survive as a single state, but within it, 2 entities were carved out. The Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, shared by Bosniaks and Croats, and the Republika Srpska, controlled by Bosnian Serbs. A fragile central government was established, but power was decentralized, leaving Bosnia united in name yet divided in practice. On December 14, 1995, in Paris, the Dayton Agreement was formally signed. For weary civilians, it was salvation. The shelling of Sarajevo stopped. Roads reopened, and families began to search for loved ones lost during the chaos. Humanitarian aid poured in, rebuilding bridges, schools, and homes. Children returned to classrooms where lessons had once been whispered in basements. For the first time in years, the sound of artillery gave way to the sound of hammers and construction. But beneath the relief lay grief. More than 100,000 people had been killed in Bosnia and millions displaced. Mass graves were only beginning to be uncovered. Survivors carried memories they could not set down. Neighbors turned enemies, towns erased, families never reunited. Dayton brought peace, but it did not bring healing. For the international community, Dayton was hailed as a triumph. The longest and bloodiest war in Europe since 1945 had finally ended. NATO troops, this time heavily armed, arrived to enforce the peace. Their presence reassured civilians that Sarajevo would not be shelled again. Yet the agreement also froze the divisions created by war. It legitimized territorial control won through violence, entrenched ethnic politics, and left Bosnia's future permanently fragile. One Western diplomat later admitted, "Dayton stopped the killing. It did not solve Bosnia." Still, in that winter of 1995, the relief was profound. After 4 years of horror, Bosnia's guns fell silent. The dead could not be brought back, the scars could not be erased, but the living finally had space to breathe, to rebuild, to hope. But even as Bosnia's war ended, another fire smoldered further south. In Kosovo, resentment had been building for years, and soon it would ignite the last and most explosive chapter of Yugoslavia's collapse. While Bosnia's war ended at Dayton, the fragile peace did not extend to all of Yugoslavia. In the southern province of Kosovo, a new storm was gathering. Kosovo held a unique place in Serbian memory. It was the site of the Battle of Kosovo, 1389, a cornerstone of national identity, celebrated in songs and myths for centuries. Yet by the 1990s, nearly 90% of Kosovo's population was ethnic Albanian. For them, the symbolism meant little. What mattered was daily repression. Since 1989, when Slobodan Milošević revoked Kosovo's autonomy, Albanians had been pushed to the margins. Schools were closed, newspapers censored, jobs stripped from those who refused to swear loyalty to Belgrade. At first, Albanians resisted peacefully, creating parallel schools and underground institutions. But patience eventually gave way to militancy. By the mid-1990s, the Kosovo Liberation Army, KLA, emerged. Small groups of fighters attacked Serbian police patrols, sabotaged infrastructure, and claimed to be the guardians of Kosovo Albanians. Belgrade branded them terrorists. But for many in Kosovo, the KLA were seen as the only ones willing to resist. Milosevic responded with overwhelming force. Villages were shelled, men rounded up, families expelled. By 1998, Kosovo's countryside was aflame. Journalists filmed columns of refugees trudging through mountains, children carrying blankets, women clutching photographs of missing sons. One Albanian farmer recalled, "They came at night. We had 1 hour to leave. We left our bread still baking in the oven." The world watched uneasily. The US and Europe, still haunted by their failures in Bosnia, debated how to respond. By early 1999, peace talks at Rambouillet collapsed. Milosevic refused demands for autonomy under international supervision. The message was clear: violence would decide Kosovo's fate. In March 1999, NATO launched Operation Allied Force, a bombing campaign that would last 78 days. From Belgrade to Novi Sad, Yugoslavia's infrastructure was pounded, bridges destroyed, factories leveled, military bases shattered. The strikes were relentless, night after night. Serb anti-aircraft defenses tried to resist, famously downing an American F-117 stealth fighter. But the imbalance of power was overwhelming. On the ground, the violence escalated. Serbian forces accelerated expulsions, pushing nearly 800,000 Albanians out of Kosovo in a campaign many described as ethnic cleansing. Refugee camps in Albania and Macedonia overflowed. Images of endless columns of people, tractors piled with possessions, dominated global headlines. By June 1999, Milosevic capitulated. Yugoslav forces withdrew from Kosovo, and NATO troops entered to occupy the province under UN mandate. Kosovo remained, officially, part of Yugoslavia, but in practice it was independent. For Albanians, it was liberation. For Serbs, it was loss of land, of heritage, of pride. The war marked the beginning of Milosevic's downfall. In 2000, mass protests, the bulldozer revolution, swept him from power. Within a year, he was on a plane to The Hague, indicted for crimes against humanity. Kosovo itself would declare independence in 2008, recognized by many, but not all. Its flag flew in the UN only in part. The wounds of 1999 remained raw, proof that in the Balkans, peace always came shadowed by unfinished history. By the dawn of the 21st century, Tito's Yugoslavia existed only in memory. What remained were a cluster of independent states: Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, and eventually Kosovo, each carrying scars of the wars that had torn them apart. The reckoning came through the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, ICTI, established in The Hague in 1993. Over 160 individuals were indicted: politicians, generals, paramilitary leaders. Names that had dominated the war now faced justice. Radovan Karadzic, the politician who masterminded ethnic cleansing; Ratko Mladic, the general of Srebrenica; Slobodan Milosevic, the Serbian president who had fanned the flames of nationalism. Some faced trial with defiance, others with silence. Milosevic himself died in custody in 2006 before a verdict could be reached. Others, like Croatian General Slobodan Praljak, made headlines by taking poison in the courtroom rather than accept judgment. Yet justice could only go so far. For survivors, no sentence could undo the graves, the rapes, the years of hunger and fear. A Bosnian mother testified at The Hague, holding a photo of her son killed at Srebrenica. "They can jail him for 100 years, but my boy will never come home." Meanwhile, the region struggled with the chaos left behind. An estimated 140,000 people had been killed, more than 2 million displaced, and entire cities like Vukovar and Sarajevo left in ruins. Weapons flooded black markets. Many would later be traced to crimes in Paris, Brussels, or Gothenburg. Organized crime thrived, often tied to ex-paramilitaries who had reinvented themselves as smugglers and traffickers. And yet, there was resilience. Sarajevo rebuilt its tram lines, Dubrovnik restored its scarred walls, Vukovar slowly reconstructed its shattered hospital. Refugees returned, even if only to ruins, determined to reclaim something of what had been stolen. Children born during the sieges grew up in new classrooms, surrounded by reminders of the past, but also by the possibility of a different future. Internationally, some of the successor states turned toward Europe. Slovenia joined the European Union in 2004, Croatia in 2013. Bosnia and Kosovo remain candidates, their futures entangled in unresolved disputes and fragile compromises. Ethnic divides still run deep, politics often paralyzed by the legacy of Dayton, but there is also a new generation with fewer memories of Tito and more interest in Brussels or Berlin. For outsiders, the Yugoslav wars remain a case study in what happens when nationalism, history, and fear overwhelm unity. For those who lived them, they are not just history, they are family stories, anniversaries, scars. In cafes from Belgrade to Sarajevo, the wars still surface in conversation. Who was guilty? Who was victim? Who suffered most? The answer, of course, is that everyone suffered, and that the Balkans, a region once called the powder keg of Europe, exploded again within living memory. Today, Tito's House of Nations is gone, but its collapse leaves behind lessons written in blood and stone, that peace built on fear cannot last, that division is easier than reconciliation, and that the cost of war is always borne most heavily by those with the least power to shape it. The Yugoslav wars are over, but in memory, in politics, in the lives of millions, they are not finished.